Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and we're back with a Total War Warhammer 3 video, but a little bit different. You see, release is coming up very soon and a lot of people are dropping their reviews. Now, I have over 300 hours into the game itself. All the hours I've played can be found on screen right now. And that's a decent amount of time, so I figured I should do a review too, give my thoughts on the game with everything. The good, the bad, the ugly, the absolutely awesome. There's a lot to discuss, so yeah, we're gonna do that. Now, full disclosure, I am a Creative Assembly content partner, which means that I have gotten the game early access and so on, and yeah, I am getting the game for free, but that is not affecting my review whatsoever. There's some things that I'm going to talk quite badly about the game, and some things I'm going to talk about it quite well. My review is 100% impartial, and obviously I'll be focusing around pretty much everything I've played with, so without further ado, let's begin. So my background in Total War goes all the way back to Rome 1, whereas my background in Warhammer Fantasy, which is what this setting is focused on, goes back all the way to when I was about 4 years old. I have been in this hobby for a very long time, collecting many of these armies. I know their lore, I know how they're supposed to act and so on, so their interpretation is something that I'm going to go into quite a bit. But with all that being said, there's a number of new playable races and factions. As you can see on screen right now, you've got access to Kislev, the Demons of Chaos, Grand CATHAY, KHORNE, NURGLE, SLAANESH and TZEENTCH, and with a pre-order incentive being the Ogre Kingdoms, meaning that if you've paid for it as a pre-order or within the first week of launch, you'll get them for free. However, if that's much later, you'll have to pay for them as a fully fledged DLC. Now, like Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, all these races are fairly unique, as they have their own different races, cultures, units, and so on. However, Warhammer 3 tries to bring it up into a next level, as most cases, Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 didn't really introduce that many unique mechanics with all of them, so this is trying to go full ham. We'll go into the specifics of each of the races in just a moment, before jumping into the stuff like the story, any changes, like say for example the Siege rework and so on, as there is a lot to talk about, and we need to talk about quite a bit. Let's start off with Kislev, as they're recommended as the first campaign. Now, Kislev has 3 legendary lords. Now, from the moment that you purchase the game and first play it, you only have access to 2. We have Tsarina Katerin, who is the Queen of Kislev in a sense, and Konstantin, who is essentially the High Priest of the Church here. Now, I'm trying to keep this as streamlined in terms of lore as possible, as that way more people who don't understand the Warhammer lore but want to check out the game will get this a bit easier. Now, there is a 3rd legendary lord, as you can see, Boris Ursus, and he'll only be available to you as you play with Kislev. When you eventually get to a certain point in your campaign, you'll be able to unlock him, and afterwards that you do, you can begin new campaigns with Boris. So he's a hidden legendary lord, which kind of leaked constantly, so he wasn't really much of a surprise. However, how this works is that you have access to 3 different legendary lords, meaning that you have a bit more replayability with Kislev than some other races. So Kislev is one of these factions which never really had an official army book, meaning that they never had a fully fledged army on the tabletop. Keep in mind that the source material that Creative Assembly bases it on for creating new factions and races and so on is going to army books, regardless of the editions too. Most cases they'll stay in 8th edition, which was the last edition of Warhammer Fantasy. However, when it came to Kislev, it's a 6th edition supplement, some stuff from the RPG series like Something is Rotting in Kislev, and now it has been confirmed a while back that there is a revival of Warhammer Fantasy as Warhammer the Old World, which is giving Kislev a rather visual overhaul. Some people were keen on that, some people were not. I didn't see too much of an issue, as, yeah, they look good, and we're going to be checking them all out in-game now anyway. So Kislev as a faction essentially follows 2 stories. One is the main campaign, which we'll go into in its own section of this video, and the second is the Kislev-specific stuff. Boris Ursus, the Tsar of Kislev, has gone missing and is presumed dead, and now the nation is fractured. Kislev itself is not a large nation, but they need to stand united as they're often considered the bulwark against chaos. In a very short way of explaining, there are constant chaos invasions throughout many years, and Kislev is always the first to stand tall against the forces of chaos. A divided nation means that they can't stand against the forces of chaos, who are preparing to launch another invasion and have been doing so in very sporadic senses. So if you're playing as either Tsarina Katerin or Konstantin, what you need to do is, well, get rid of the invaders, as there's a few Norskins already coming into your territories, and there are a few rebellious factions who have stood against you. You need to pacify any rebellions, you need to destroy any rivals, and you need to make sure that Kislev stands united once once more. Now, regardless of who you play, the general thing stands the same. Build up your buildings, get some new construction going, get armies up and running, and obviously work through research to make sure that you're stronger and stronger as you eventually deal with harder and harder enemies. But now let's go into the specifics of certain things because it's important to know. Kislev as a nation is very small, and construction-wise their style of building is very different to what we're normally used to. You see, Kislev has 3 major cities, and everything else, the other provinces, those are all minor settlements. So what I mean is that the city of Kislev, the city of Prague, and the city of Edingrad can level up to tier 5, being your main hubs of recruitment for all your major troops, pretty much the grand majority of your roster, or any of your good units, whereas everything surrounding focuses on your economy and everything else, meaning that you will not be able to even get your provincial capitals for those minor provinces up to tier 5. You won't be able to recruit a lot of your units from it. It works in a very the biggest cities support the smaller ones. It's a very different style of gameplay that we're not really too used to, especially with the Warhammer series, and it can get confusing at first, but use your main cities to build up your forces, and your minor ones to just boost up your economy as much as possible, and work towards your secondary campaign objective, which is kinda primary too. That's what's on screen right now, and basically, you're competing with the other major Kislevite faction. If you're playing as Catherine, you'll be competing against Konstantin, where you need to gather supporters. As you gather supporters, you can eventually cross thresholds to get better buffs and so on. The thing is that, yeah, this does become a bit of an issue because you're essentially doing 2 storylines at the same time, as one's working against the other, but then you also have to go with the whole demon soul aspect that we'll talk about later. But that can get a bit hectic, as no other faction has 2 stories going on at the same time, and the fact is that, yeah, supporters and so on are gained for a different amount of ways, as you need a lot of devotion for that too, which is its own thing entirely, and you will lose supporters if you have to fight against other Kislevite factions, which, yeah, you start with a rebellion at the very beginning, so you're gonna have to deal with that and lose supporters. That means that you're also gonna have to build up the Orthodoxy Church, which helps you get devotion and supporters, but you're going to have to spend a slot on them. You're going to kind of be shoehorned onto it. The harder the difficulty, the faster that they'll gain supporters, so you're going to have to be able to rival your actual opponent. And yes, while I am sounding quite negative, it's because there's just a lot to do, because when you have to factor in the main story, I feel like the Kislevite campaign is stretched out a bit too thin, and that becomes a bit of an issue. However, I feel like it's extremely thematic, and obviously it makes sense for Kislev, but this is definitely not a first campaign playthrough if you're not used to dealing with multiple things at once. However, there are a lot of benefits towards Kislev too, so let's talk about those, because yeah, this is a pretty interesting faction. At the very beginning I was worried that due to the changes in law, the units and so on, that this would not feel like the nation that I knew when I was just a small boy. Keep in mind that I've been following the lore of Warhammer Fantasy for many years, but Kislev still feels like Kislev. You've got a lot of units who are based on skirmishing, you've got a lot of units who are hybridized. Hybrid units are the majority of your roster. You can see this on screen right now, where I've got a very small army. It's pretty much your starter army, but everything's got access to either melee or ranged, barring your cavalry, because your cavalry is a bit more specialized. But that means that your faction is geared to fight pretty much anything that's thrown at it, and that's Kislev. That's the best thing I can say. It feels like Kislev. Hybrid factions are very strong, but you are in the front line, and you pretty much border Norska, the Chaos Wastes, and so on. All the main demon factions will eventually start making their way down, and eventually start hitting you. That means that you need to have strong troops to be able to fight the forces of KHORNE, NURGLE, whatever gets thrown at you, and I feel like the Kislevite roster does do that. There are some missing stuff in the roster and so on. It's usually the case that DLC is going to happen, and well, this is Total War. If you're not used to DLC, you shouldn't really be playing this. But all in all, I'd say that you don't really need DLC. The base game faction is fine, and it's probably one of the better ones out of all the playable factions that are available from launch. Just in terms of fighting style and so on, and keep in mind that I'm focusing heavily on campaign and not multiplayer, as I'm not a multiplayer person, I'd say that it works out quite well. Kislev does hold itself against pretty much any faction that throws itself against it, and in most cases, even the AI will form rather large nations due to the fact that their units are so incredibly versatile. Next, we can move on to Grand CATHAY, and this was a high selling point for the game. You see, Grand CATHAY was established in lore many years back. They received little tidbits of lore here and there, but they never had a fully fledged army book. They never really had any lore books. Everything that we knew about Grand CATHAY was literally based on footnotes. Yet, many people, including myself, were very curious about this as, well, it's one of those nations in Warhammer that everyone wanted to see, and we didn't know how it was going to be. You see, it's obviously inspired by a fantasy version of China in a medieval state, and, well, that's pretty much how Warhammer Fantasy is in general. But still, we were curious, and still we asked, and Creative Assembly, with the help of Games Workshop, this is very important, as Games Workshop did have to create an army book for this. Yep, we have an army book, which we'll likely get in Old World. So we have two legendary lords, Miao Ying the Storm Dragon and Zhao Ming the Iron Dragon. These are ancient dragons who take on human form and dragon form alike, and they are extremely powerful. They aren't the true leaders of the faction, as their parents, the Dragon Emperor and the Moon Empress, are the ones that lead Grand CATHAY. However, you're charged with specific tasks. Miao Ying will focus on defending the Great Bastion, which is the Warhammer Fantasy equivalent of the Great Wall, and Zhao Ming will focus on retaking territories which have been lost to a lot of corruption, mainly through the fact of Warpstone and their own devices too, due to the creation of the Great Maw. Grand CATHAY as a nation is another human faction. However, we do know that there are some animals, beastmen and so on which do help, but we're not going to see them until future DLC, that's for sure. Now, the best way to explain them is very much as a hybrid faction, but very different to that what you've seen of Kislev, whereas rather than having a lot of units that do multiple things at once, here you are more or less kind of working towards mixing your army. This means that you'll want to have different mixes of both melee and ranged units to be able to get benefits such as harmony from it, and this means that your armies are going to be quite varied, which is very different when it comes to, say, for example, normal Total War Warhammer factions, where you normally focus around one or two specific units, sometimes even doom stacking. Here your armies will make use of so many different units, as you can see here. This is my starter army, which has access to a few swordsmen, which are quite heavily armored, some peasants long spearmen, some peasant bowmen, and it's varied, and the closer they are together, the better the benefit. If they are too far away, they won't benefit from each other, as this is a subsection of a harmony mechanic that we'll talk about later. So CATHAY, like every other base game race of Warhammer 3, has the same campaign with the same story. We'll get to that later, but that means that you have it a bit more relaxed than, say, Kislev. Now, you do have your own stuff, but that's going to be talked about a little bit later. The main thing at the moment is you need to fight with all the different enemies which are right now inside Grand CATHAY. There's a few Skaven, Orcs, Ogres, and even some Chaos factions that have either managed to breach the Great Bastion or have traveled through the Mountains of Morn down to your territories. There are also some Cathayan rebels that you need to deal with, as the country itself is not in harmony. You need to strive to bring everyone together for unity to be able to stand as one of the most powerful nations of the Warhammer Fantasy world. Now, one thing that Grand CATHAY has to make them very unique, especially when comparing to any of the other human nations, or better yet said, pretty much anything that's been established in Total War Warhammer so far, is the inclusion of a caravan mechanic. Which pretty much is how you expect it. You are a trader nation. Grand CATHAY is known for its high levels of trade, and you're able to send off a caravan to different points of the Warhammer Fantasy world, obviously anything that's available in the map to play, and sell off your cargo to get a large amount of money depending on where you go. The further the distance, the more money. This means that you can pretty much have more of a roleplay aspect. Everything that we do know, like I said, about Grand CATHAY is that they're powerful, but they're also known for trade. It's got a lot of theme to it, and that means that you will also be able to establish any communications with loads of different factions as long as you're able to see them. I think because of that, you're able to establish a lot more map control, as you're able to talk to different factions, establish diplomacy with them, and so on, even if you're on the other side of the world, as that's pretty early on. Now, there are a few things. Obviously, if you have cargo, that means that others will start to look at it and say, ooh, this is an army that has a lot of valuables. And that's pretty cool, as that means that your cargoes are at risk of being attacked. Be this by random events, as there is risk from traveling from location to location, or by enemies who you might be at war with, as this is a lore that you don't control. The lord itself will start moving through the areas. The only time you take true control of these armies and the caravans themselves is when a dilemma pops up, or if they're put into battle. During this time of recording for this review itself, I think that the caravan was attacked around 3 or 4 times by ogre mercenaries. Now, I'm a very big fan of this because, well, So you have to keep in mind that Total War sometimes does lull, especially if you're building up your economy and so on. You might not be getting into a lot of fights, but this is Total War. You need fights, and this allows you to play not only with just diplomacy, but get into more fights. It acts as something that you don't have to do, though it's very beneficial for you, as you will become an economic powerhouse with this, especially if you pick the right areas to go sell your cargo to, but it also gives you an army that you need to make sure that you're gearing up through skill points and so on. When dilemmas happen, are you getting the right units? You don't recruit these normally, and this is a very interesting way of establishing something that we've never really seen in Total War before. CATHAY as a nation still feels like a human faction, but has all these little different mechanics on the side to give you a different feeling. If you compare them to, say, for example, the Empire, you have a lot more to go with the caravans defending the Great Bastion and so on. Whereas the Empire has its own unique mechanics with Imperial Court and so on, but eventually just becomes unusable. You just literally have no reason to use it. So you do have access to a kind of side campaign narrative, and that's obviously the fact that, well, Grand CATHAY is constantly under threat by the forces of chaos. You're one of the most northern nations, and you're right next to the Chaos Wastes. This is measured by your threat level, as you can see here, and essentially what this means is when the threat bar gets to full, Chaos armies will spawn more and more frequently at the Great Bastion. Now, I'm playing a Zhao Ming, so it's kind of inconsequential, as I've got my sister Miao Ying dealing with that. You kind of get this more with a sister than you do with a brother. Eventually you will if you start taking over your territories and obviously confederating with your sister and so on, but in most cases, it's kind of something that you can ignore with Zhao Ming. Now, there is a mechanic that we do need to talk about, which is harmony. So harmony is something that gets mentioned a lot throughout Grand CATHAY, and it's something which can cause a lot of confusion, I must admit, mainly because it's so centered on so many different factors, and it does have something to play through in your campaign. Harmony is a resource which has different factors, and if you work your harmony in certain ways, you can get different bonuses, but you can also get negatives too. The best way is to get true harmony, which is a mix of yin and yang. Yin and yang are the two factors here, so if you recruit a lord, they're worth something in terms of yin or in terms of yang. If you work on some buildings, you construct something, those also have different yin and yang factors. Not only that, but your research also affects your yin and yang, so depending on what you do, how you expand and so on, this can give you negatives, like for example -6 control, which can be a bit of a clutch if you're expanding too heavily, or if you're playing on, say for example, legendary mode. I mean, the -6 control you can already feel in normal mode too. It very much depends, and what I feel is this is a lot of mathematics, because you have to kind of plan ahead. Okay, I've taken 2 new settlements, but I'm very focused on yin at the moment, so I'm going to have to start focusing on yang buildings, or maybe I should start recruiting some more yang-based lords. Sometimes you'll even forget about that too. It's something which is a lot of maths. Some people might like this mechanic as obviously it feels more into the nation and you're taking a lot more control into the administrative side of Grand CATHAY, but there's a lot of issues here. As with most Total War games and pretty much every single other faction, you don't have to worry about something like this, so it does become an issue when you're just trying to play. That's the best way I can say it. Now, I'm not talking about this too badly, as it is very thematic, as I've said before, but there's too much of a heavy emphasis on this, especially as it's pretty much tied to everything. Yin and Yang also has stuff with your troops, but that is more with getting bonuses with your armies and so on, and that's just keeping your troops together. That's pretty much it. It's so simple. Next, we'll move on to KHORNE with only one playable legendary lord, Skarbrand the Exiled. Now, it's important to note that any of the monogod factions are kind of based on a mix of different army books, as there was no monogod books back in the day. So for KHORNE specifically, we have access to units from the Warriors of Chaos army book, the Demons of Chaos army book, and also the Beastmen army book too. Now, your legendary lord, as I said, is Skarbrand the Exiled, a bloodthirster who once turned around and tried to attack the blood god himself, his own deity. That, as expected, was a backfiring event, and Skarbrand was forever changed, as he now no longer has ability to fly, and he was damaged to the point that he looks permanently scarred. Now, this Khaornate section might be a bit smaller than all the other race overviews, but this is not a bad thing, trust me. So the main purpose of the Khaornate factions is to fight, 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 and fight. Oh, did I mention fighting? Yeah, it's a rather simple campaign. You don't have access to all your usual stuff like building up settlements, working on research and so on, but everything is geared towards fighting. Your campaign is literally geared towards as much fighting as possible, and this is a true representation of what KHORNE, the Blood God, is and what his forces represent. There is no need for Ponzi diplomacy. There is no need to construct settlements, as you can just damage them, destroy them, and if your corruption's high enough, then they will automatically come to you anyway, as settlers will fall to the blood god. Like I said, the idea is to keep fighting, and this is total war. You want to fight. Well, with KHORNE, you're going to be able to do so. The first few clips that you're seeing on screen is literally from the first turn, where I was managing to get into 3 fights. One, which is the spawner enemy that you deal with at the beginning, their first settlement, and then I've spawned an army to go and fight me. Yeah, you can summon armies to just target yourself. This allows you to keep on moving, as the more you fight, and if you win that fight or even raise a settlement, then you get more movement. You can keep on moving. You can keep on destroying stuff. I must admit, when the preview started dropping, I thought, well, KHORNE was not going to be a faction that I was going to enjoy, and that kept with me until I started playing. Skarbrand now stands as one of the highest ranked in my own personal list. I really enjoy this. It's so different because you're not focusing on diplomacy, which now is viable in Warhammer 3, by the way, or you're not focusing on building up settlements until they eventually just come to you for free. You're just focusing on doing as much damage as possible. You start in such a good area because you have a variety of different other demon factions and chaos factions to fight against, or you can just gun down all the way to Kislev and start fighting all the humans. You literally can just go out there and do damage. The fact is, you can also recruit on the move with demonic stance, so yeah, you're good. You're good. You can literally just do as much damage as possible. I will admit that Skarbrand himself is a bit overtuned, as he can get the most movement out of everything, just getting into fights or raising settlements and so on, and yeah, he's very, very powerful. Then again, he is Skarbrand. He's supposed to be one of the strongest bloodthirsters to have ever existed, so it works, but it's a little broken. That being said, unlike CATHAY and Kislev, which obviously had to get rewritten for this and so on, they had a lot of source material to go for KHORNE, and KHORNE is the truest representation as I can see it. This is from a lore standpoint, even comparing it to gameplay. It's just really, really well done. The roster stands out really well. Yeah, you've got pretty much no range barring the skull cannon, and you've got no magic whatsoever, which can sound like a clutch, though your stuff is pretty spell resistant, so you're okay. And you don't want range. KHORNE doesn't want range. You just want to go in and smash your enemy. As soon as you lock down anything in melee, they're pretty much gone. You've got stuff which is there to do damage, though you will take a lot of range damage, so you have to kind of switch between not only having just demons, but also having a little bit of mortals too for the heavier armor and so on. There is definitely incentive here to have a mix of both range and mortals. This is one of the few chaos factions which have that incentive, that's for sure. Next we have the forces of NURGLE, being led by Khorgarth Plaguefather. Once again, this is another monogod faction that did not have its own army book, but rather is based on 3 separate books. This is the Warriors of Chaos, the Demons of Chaos, and interestingly enough, a Forge World supplement known as Tamukhan. This, I believe, is the first time that we have a base game army being released with Forge World units, which is quite cool. Now, this is a very different campaign. We're going to jump right into it very soon, but I believe that NURGLE has the most unique campaign out of pretty much everything here. If you're looking for a fast campaign, well, you're not going to get that with NURGLE. NURGLE perhaps has one of the slowest campaigns due to his mechanics. You see, your buildings will not be constructed in the usual sense. They'll be fairly expensive, but you only have to build the first tier, after which it will cycle through all the other tiers, unlocking different units for you in a, well, let me just be honest, it's kind of slow, because this is the only way that you're able to recruit units. You go through the cycles depending on what you want. Each building obviously has different units available in its pool, and then when that cycle happens, you will then get 1 or 2, depending on how many buildings you have, of the associated unit of that particular cycle. Then you can recruit those units pretty much instantly. The only thing is that they will pop up a little weaker, and not only that, but that means that your recruitment is going to be a lot slower. If you don't have a lot of infrastructure buildings, because those can give you some nurglings, or any advanced military or basic military buildings, you're not going to be able to get an army. So your campaign at the very beginning is very, very slow, borderline tedious, unless you build a lot of stuff to get loads of nurglings, though those aren't the best unit. However, as you start expanding and as your empire grows and grows and grows and grows, you will be able to basically steamroll anyone by spawning an army and then having them as a full 20 stack by the end of that turn. Provided, however, that you do have the available income and so on, because NURGLE, yeah, it's kind of expensive. Everything is pretty expensive for NURGLE. Nurgle. Everything else, however, is very much Total War, where you decide to attack enemy armies, take over settlements and so on, and you build up from there. Now, you do need to build up. You will not be able to have a small nation if you want a lot of different troops. But some of your buildings are beneficial, like for example, your growth building can give you 40 growth per turn, which is absolutely massive, as most of these provinces have 3-4 settlements. That's 120 growth per turn, so you will be growing further and further and unlocking the stronger units, which are gated to the specific tier of the settlement. Now, what makes Nurgle very, very unique is the literal use of chemical warfare. As you gain infections, which is a new currency only available to Nurgle factions, you'll be able to then use those infections to create plagues. Yep, you've heard me. Now, these plagues can be used to either benefit your own armies and settlements, as obviously Nurgle-ish factions should not be affected by any of these plagues in a negative way, or you can make plagues to, well, damage your enemies, cause attrition, reduce their campaign movement, and so on, and as time progresses, you'll unlock more symptoms, which will allow you to make those plagues even stronger, even getting to super plagues, which are very, very powerful. These are all stuff that has been known in lore, and they are very, very dangerous. The plagues themselves have so many different uses that you can spend a lot of time in this page just having fun and creating your own little concoctions. Like I said before, your campaign is also very, very slow, and it's going to take a while before you start snowballing, but your army is slow too, as, well, they're all kind of rotting away. They're plague infested. These are very gangrenous units who are going to move in a very slow position. However, because of all the plagues that affect them, they are also very, very durable. Eventually, as you can see on screen right now, you can get a bunch of different units, and yes, these might be low tier, but they can hit hard. And you can swarm over your enemy, as, well, they won't be expecting a literal moving wall of flesh. Nurgle's campaign is very enjoyable, but you're not able to go guns blazing. You'll need to strategize. I think this, out of all the factions that have been released, not just in Total War Warhammer 3, but in the Warhammer series as a whole, this is the one that will require a lot more strategizing because you don't have active recruitment. Where the term slow and steady wins the race is done here in a very literal sense, and I'm not saying that as a bad thing. This is one of the more interesting campaigns because it's so drastically different, where everything else recruits in a literal normal sense. Every other race and faction can build up in a normal sense just by building up a building and then just recruiting from that building. Nurgle, you need to wait, you need to plan. What do I want? What units do I need in this cycle? What units do I want to have in the next few turns? This is so different. I've had a lot of fun, but it can get frustrating if you're not used to this. As soon as you start your campaign, you need to think and start planning for 10 turns in advance, 20 turns in advance even in some cases, and that might sound frustrating, but it's cool, it's different, it's very inspired. I'm personally not ranking all the different lords and factions here in this video, as I don't think that this would be fair, but I must say that Nurgle's faction is so different that you might as well warrant a second, even third playthrough. Try different strategies, plan out differently, go attack different locations, and just build up your armies in a different sense with your settlements. It's so different in a good way. Next we had the forces of SLAANESH being led by the Keeper of Secrets, Nekari. Once again, this is based on multiple books, which this time is just the Warriors of Chaos 8th edition army book and the Demons of Chaos 8th edition army book. There's a healthy amount of mixing here. There's not a lot of units, it's mostly variants, but there's a lot to do with SLAANESH. You see, SLAANESH is my favorite Chaos God. I've been waiting for this for practically years now. I've been wanting to play as a proper SLAANEShy faction. Yes, we did have Sigvald, but no SLAANEShy troops. And there is a lot to talk about SLAANESH, so let's not waste any more time. SLAANESH's faction will focus around traditional Total War, so you build up your faction, you build up your settlements, you build up your armies. Everything is, well, if you've played Total War before, it's that simple. There's no strange mechanics which keep you slowed down or speed you up, but the gameplay itself can be a bit different if you factor in a few different things. Firstly, you're playing a faction which focuses around very heavy micro, fast-moving units both on foot and mounted, one of the fastest, if not the fastest units throughout the whole roster and the whole game. But there is obviously a clutch. Your units might be fast, but they're very glass cannon. You have access to barely any armor, barely any big damage output unless you're pretty much flanking your enemy and so on, and this will be very obvious to you from the very beginning. Even fighting against coordinate forces, you have units that can outflank. Like I said, you have access to chariots and mounted units with 100 speed. That is literally the fastest I've seen so far without any augmentations. And you do have access to a bunch of different Chaos Warrior units in the form of Marauders, which have shields and so on, but very little armor, and that's pretty much the most armor you'll ever see, barring some chariots. Now, it's important to note here that chariots are not performing very well, which can be a massive clutch, especially for Slaaneshi factions, as the main focus around your force is to eventually get a lot of cavalry and a lot of different chariots to be able to gun down your enemy. Now, your cavalry can do that just fine, Seekers are fantastic, but anything to do with a chariot is really underperforming at the moment, so you're going to have to focus more on cavalry, a lot of footmen, and a lot of magic. Magic at the moment is quite volatile, I must say, especially since you have access to what can be considered the strongest spell in the whole of Warhammer 3 at the moment, as the Law of Shadows does need a bit of fine-tuning. It's not so much of a problem for campaign as this gives you a leg up, but if you're playing multiplayer and so on, yeah, it's kind of powerful. We'll talk about that later on. The good thing, however, is since you're so mobile, you can use loads of different hit and run tactics, so unless you're fighting against something which can stay stationary and just stay in one position, you're going to be able to just run circles around your enemy and hit them from every single flank. What sets N'Kari apart from the other Chaos factions is that you have a lot of map control. This is for the whole campaign map, as you're able to spawn in cults by using your devotees. Devotees are a unique currency only available to Slaaneshi factions, and as you start spawning cults, then you can start using cult buildings to get more devotees, and yeah, you'll be able to get a lot of vision throughout the whole map. It's not just that, you're able to get a lot of different benefits. You're also going to be able to help with the ascendancy for Slaanesh, and with cults you're able to then start to influence different human, elf, and beastmen factions. Keep in mind, beastmen can't use settlements, so yeah, mostly just elves when eventually they get added in, and humans, because it's just humans right now. This is simply because, as your cults are there, they'll start to influence the faction, which then will allow you to start working towards your machinations against these factions, getting different types of diplomacy with them. This is taking use of the diplomacy rework, where with Slaanesh, it's not focused around getting that non-aggression pact or that trade agreement. In fact, yes, they're still useful, but it's more of the case of being able to vassalize factions. You can vassalize pretty much any human, elf, or beastman faction, so you can take advantage of a lot of things. You remember the Order Tide from Game 1 and Game 2? Well, what if N'Kari forms his own Order Tide, with various different factions where he can just expand and expand and expand? Now, I've already said that chariots aren't working too well, and this is something that I hope gets patched out in the future, but there are a few things that you need to know about the Slaanesh campaign, as it does change your playstyle quite a bit. Now, when you go into battle, cavalry builds and all that, that's all very, very useful. You want to use cav, you want to use chariots, you want to use marauders and so on, because they are your only shield and front line. But you can go around with a full skirmish army, as long as you know how to micro. This is a very, very micro-intensive faction. If you're thinking that you can play Slaanesh just by slamming yourself directly into the enemy without going for the flank and the rear, you're gonna have a bad time. Believe me, you're gonna have a very, very bad time. Magic is very useful. Like I said, the Law of Shadows is very broken at the moment, so if that's the case, I imagine it's gonna get fixed. Until then, take advantage of it, believe me. This is especially the case when it comes to, say, for example, sieges and so on. Since you're a cavalry, mostly based army, you're not going to have a good time attacking settlements, or even defending them sometimes. Don't worry, we'll be talking about the siege rework in just a small time, but it's the main case that Slaanesh does struggle there. Open field battles, however, that's where Slaanesh really comes to shine. Since your superior speed can get you pretty much in and out without too much of a problem, you're able to decimate quite a lot of factions. However, there is a few caveats here which we do need to talk about. You have no heavy armor, meaning that you can't really take a punch. You are probably one of the squishiest factions that exists in the game. Personally speaking, and this is something very, very important, people got pissed off with the fact of the recolors, right? And this is directly to the community, and I understand that. However, factions like Slaanesh desperately needed at least one or two recolors would have been very helpful with some possible new units or even reskins to change up the look down the line. Out of all the factions, Slaanesh desperately needed units, even if it was some sort of recolor. It's just, I've played a lot with Slaanesh, and it's very noticeable to me and a few other creators, without having a decent amount of hammer, you can't really anvil, and this is a faction that's pretty much designed to be a hammer and anvil. I'd say it's still a very strong faction, but it is noticeably weaker, especially in late game when you start to see enemies bringing heavy artillery, bigger monsters, stuff that can't normally be taken down. You don't have a lot of anti-large. You do have with marauders on foot, but they'll die very easily, or with the Hellstriders with spears, but again, very, very squishy. You don't want to charge them directly into a Bloodthirster. It's not going to give you a good time. So Nesh is still fairly enjoyable, I must admit. This is still a faction that I really enjoyed playing, but yeah, the future will need to bring in some stuff to fix her up a little bit, or else she's going to fall behind very, very quickly. So now we'll look towards Tzeentch, led by Kairos Fateweaver as the Oracles of Tzeentch, and again, this faction is based on the 8th edition army book for both the Warriors of Chaos and the Demons of Chaos. It's just important for people who might be curious as to where the inspiration for these forces comes from. This is a heavily based magic faction. If you understand anything regarding Tzeentch, your warriors are generally a little bit tanky because they do have a barrier, but your main output is magical damage. You're not really a melee faction, so if anything gets too close, you might begin to suffer. The Tzeentchian campaign is rather simple, probably one of the easiest out there, mainly because you start off with a decent stack, then you've also got a lot of hybrid units. A lot of your stuff, yes, they're not really based for melee damage, but they can do a decent amount. The main thing is that they're all pretty good at range, and they do a lot of it. Yes, it's not the furthest distance, but even with a short range with, like, say, 160, 140, you're still able to just knock a lot of things before they even get to you. Construction's the same, everything's pretty much the same. It's very streamlined, where you expect a lot of different stuff, especially because this is Tzeentch and nothing is supposed to make sense with this god or his forces, but you are able to just enjoy the classic Total War feel. Battle-wise, early on you'll start to dominate, mainly because, again, you've got loads of range, you've got spellcasters. Kairos himself is a very powerful character. He's already starting with a few spells unlocked and already boosted up to, so you can overcast as much as you please. I'd say that Tzeentch probably has one of the best starts, and through my experience is probably one of the easiest factions to play. With Kairos himself being a one-man army at the very beginning, it gets you used to being more reliant on spells more than anything, as your damage output can increase dramatically if you bring more spellcasters. The fact is that all your spellcasters are so incredibly mobile, especially since you can get them on flying mounts, that not so much of an issue is going to be had in most battles, unless of course they get targeted. You have to keep an eye on them, because they will get targeted. The main thing that makes Tzeentch unique is the fact that you have a mechanic known as Changing of the Ways, which you get to trade settlements, force factions into war with each other, and so on. This is basically trying to play with the AI's head, which is quite difficult as it is, as the Total War AI is generally quite unpredictable, and it does provide for a lot of fun. Obviously, this is more you playing the puppet master more than anything, and it's something that you need to use if you want to have the proper Tzeentchian experience. You can completely forget about this mechanic, but at that point, then the faction's just pretty much Tzeentchian demons and that's it. Which, in itself, they are quite good. The spellcasting is wonderful, you're able to do such a large damage output with Flamers of Tzeentch and so on, but without this, the faction's just pretty much standard. For example, at the very beginning you can start trading settlements, which means that you can transfer one directly to you so you can control it without having to fight, or you can give it to one of your allies. It really depends on what you want to do. You can even force this by putting an enemy very close to another enemy, make them start fighting. It really depends on what you can think to come up with, and obviously with the limitations if you have enough grimoires, which is the mechanic involved with that. The Tzeentchian campaign itself is fun, I'm not going to complain, because it's definitely one of the strongest. You have access to so much violent firepower that you're able to do just so much damage. It's absolutely ridiculous. You have access to two laws of magic, the law of Tzeentch and the law of metal, which the law of metal itself is quite good, but it's not just that, it's all the range, it's all the flying units. You have access to so much here, and there is something which we'll be talking about later on in the video, which will be a source of complaints, but it's also relating to Tzeentch too. But if you're looking for an easier sort of campaign, Tzeentch is there, and yeah, it's like pretty much idiot-proof, because I've been playing in various different difficulties, all the way from easy to legendary. I've had no issues. I've had no issues whatsoever. Again, it is important to stress out that being mobile or having a lot of firepower is important. If they get too close to you, you're done for. It's just mainly that. Your barrier can protect you, but eventually it will fade, especially if they keep hitting you. But like you see here, this is very early into my campaign, but you can already get Pink Horrors, which are your second tier infantry, but they are your main range source. They're able to do a lot of damage. It doesn't take long to be able to recruit these, as long as you're being smart with your cash. And this this fight itself is pretty near Nangao itself, which is the capital of Miaoying, so I've already brute forced my way into Grand Cathay. It doesn't take that long to do. The great thing about the TZEENTCH campaign is that you're very far away from other Chaos factions, which might sound a bit strange because you're very close to Grand Cathay, but with no other Chaos factions near you, you're not really fighting for control for a specific area. In fact, you only really have to deal with one Khornate faction that starts at war with you, and even then the ogres will usually keep them busy, so you can fight your way into Grand Cathay. You know what you're fighting against, you know what you're dealing against, and you have no surprises coming from your west, north, or even south. Everything is just one enemy, and you have a lot of variety of enemies, don't get me wrong, but it allows you to focus down one area of the map so you don't have to feel like you have to fight in multiple fronts. And lastly, for the base game factions, we have the Legions of Chaos. This is Chaos Undivided, which means that you'll have access to the rosters from NURGLE, TZEENTCH, SLAANESH, and KHORNE, all four of them, leading you to have one of the largest possible rosters throughout the Total War Warhammer series. The character himself can be renamed, because he can be anything you want him to be. He's a no mark, essentially. It's a very strange thing. This is the first time that we've been able to name our own characters in the Total War series like this. I don't mean a generic character. This is your legendary lord. He was written in a form of story arc for Warhammer 3, and we'll get to the story eventually, but yeah, this demon can be named anything you want. Instead of bringing in a character which is very well known to be an undivided character, he's in-game, but he's not a legendary lord. We'll talk about that later, but let's jump into the Undivided faction, because it is very unique. While I might sound a bit negative, that's true, but this faction is extremely unique, and it does present a lot of interesting gameplay. So like I said, the faction represents Chaos Undivided, meaning that you have access to units from all four rosters, and you can expand on that as you wish. So it's a quite overpowered faction. If you're looking for this as a first time thing, this one is probably going to work out quite well for you, because yeah, you literally have the benefits but none of the negatives of all four demon factions. You can see that very early on, it's very apparent. Whilst you're not really fighting anything too dangerous because these are starter armies and so on, you come with a mixture of so many different things that you're able to have a damage output which is just absolutely ridiculous, and this continues as you progress through the game. It doesn't matter if you dedicate yourself or not, as you can decide to just dedicate yourself to a specific god and just wholly recruit units from, say for example, just TZEENTCH or just SLAANESH, but you can go Undivided and get everything there. There are of course limitations because they didn't want to make the campaign too overpowered, yet it kind of still is, and that's going to be explained right now. It's not done too badly, I must say. Keep in mind that Chaos Undivided was always going to be expecting to be extremely overpowered, which is why we ended up getting some mono-god factions too, because you've got everything, you've got the best of everything. As you take over settlements, you're able to dedicate the settlement to a specific god, meaning that then you can start recruiting units from said god. So if I dedicate this one to, say, TZEENTCH, I'll be then able to start building up buildings specifically about TZEENTCH, so then I can start getting TZEENTCH in units like blue horrors, pink horrors, and so on and so forth. The great thing is, you can also mix and match your buildings, so if you want to have one province recruiting units from all of them, which would be kind of limited, keep in mind, you are more than able to. It just depends on how you want to do it. Personally, I've been playing it in a way where I'm dedicating a full province to one god, another province to another god, another province to another god, and so on. This is a great system because it's unlockable buildings. This is something I really like, as that means that for future factions, something like this could be done too. As, yeah, you know, you can just take over settlements, not hard-coded to your faction. You have 4 different rosters, 4 separate faction sides to your actual playable faction. This makes this faction incredibly easy, even if you're playing in harder difficulties, because you're able to mix and match as you wish. You're able to tailor your armies in such a great way. While certain demons could be weaker when they're by themselves, like say for example, SLAANESH demonettes, they're great for doing damage, but they're glass cannon. However, if they're supported by plague bearers in the front, their value is increased tenfold just purely because of the whole hammer and anvil thing that I said was missing from the generic SLAANESH faction. Obviously there are some limitations in place so you don't snowball at the very beginning of the campaign, and that's in the form of demonic glory. As you start killing factions or getting into fights, whatever you want to do, you'll be able to earn some glory. And with that, you can dedicate it to Undivided, you can dedicate it to KHORNE, NURGLE, SLAANESH, or TZEENTCH, whichever you please out of the whole 5. The more glory you get, you see you'll go up through progress bars, which will allow you to not only unlock certain items that we'll get to in just a second, but will unlock buffs. It'll unlock the ability to recruit higher tier units and so on. So you're able to get a lot out of this. You're able to get a lot just in general. And it's a system that I very much like because, like I said, if you had access to everything normally, especially with a Legions of Chaos faction, you would then snowball without too much of a problem. Nothing would be able to fight you back. So now you actually have to work through this to be able to unlock units as you go. And yeah, your list can get pretty disgusting. And all this glory ties to perhaps one of the most impressive mechanics that I've ever seen implemented into Total War: full customization. As you get more and more glory with all of the gods, you will get blessed with different blessings from them, even Undivided too, and you can customize your character with different items to change his look completely. He's still a demon prince, but this is the ultimate merging of Total War, Warhammer, and tabletop. You can build your demon prince, and I think this is absolutely awesome. This allows for so much customization. You can turn the character into a full demon prince of TZEENTCH and have loads of different spells, turn him into a demon prince of KHORNE and make him a melee powerhouse. It very much depends on your likes and dislikes. It completely blew my mind once I saw it, and this is probably one of the best features ever added into Total War Warhammer. And loads of people now want it for other races, which I don't think could happen because they want to keep it special, I guess. But either way, you've got something really, really special here. Not only do you have a Demon Prince of Undivided, which has been the first time for, what, 15 years? Something like that. Keep in mind that Undivided Demon Princes were written out of lore, so something this style is very ambitious. It needs to be done right, and it has been done right. Having access to all the different rosters too gives you a proper feel of Undivided, which many people wanted too. I must admit I've had a lot of fun with this faction, but it's horrendously overpowered, which is kind of expected. So if you're looking for something to play with to have fun, this is definitely it. Just don't expect to have a Total War experience normally, because you're going to be decimating pretty much anything that walks in your path. My only issue with this faction, however, despite the fact that yes, everything is really, really cool, is I don't like the character. It's that simple. Yes, I think this faction is amazing and the mechanics involved are absolutely incredible. Everything is just so cool, but I don't like the character. He was introduced for the Total War Warhammer series, and look, there's so many different characters that should be getting center stage, but a lot of them get replaced by new things, and it just doesn't make sense to me. The series itself is 30 years old. There's so much to go through. I have no reason to care about this character specifically. He's new. He's not been in established books. He's never been in any Warhammer thing. He's just here for Total War Warhammer, and don't get me wrong, like I said, I love the playstyle. I think it's amazing. But why a character which is a no-mark, literally just fabricated for this game, when there's so many cool characters that could literally come in and just change that up? Perhaps having the same story, obviously maybe not some customability, which obviously that's why they've created this character, or at the very least having two Chaos Undivided factions, because if we can have two for CATHAY and we can have three for Kislev, why not two for one of the biggest rosters possible to allow for more replayability? You get that anyway, but you know what I mean. And admittedly, my frustrations are there because of Belakor. You see, Belakor is in the game. He's a character that you can obtain after completing the campaign, which, yeah, you know, that's not the point. A big character like this, only obtainable after completing the campaign, is a massive issue because, well, the campaign's over. You've done the narrative. Afterwards, yeah, you can continue to carry on playing for the whole sandbox element and so on, but he's not a legendary lord. He's a lord that you can control, and keep in mind that he has no faction and so on. Never mind the model. I think the model is perfectly fine. I like the original Belakor. The big issue being that tail over there, which I don't know what's going on there. It's just been happening to everyone. But this is a big character, and yes, they introduced him to be the whole villain, but in Warhammer 2, the Skaven were the villain, and you could play as them. They had their own factions. Why not Belakor? There are 10 legendary lords in the game, not including the ogres. He could have easily been a second Chaos Undivided. Beat the game, say, with one or maybe even all the factions and unlock Belakor. That would have been really, really cool. Instead, he's there for the end of your campaign. So if you go through all the stories and so on, he's there by turn 100 if you do all the souls as soon as you can. And at that point, well, 130. So at that point, pretty much the game's done, depending on if you've been expanding and so on. So the campaign's pretty much done at that point, and you've got him for a little bit, but he doesn't have his own unique skill lines or anything. He's just Belakor. He's just the character, the model, and a few things, and that's it. So I'll be very perfectly honest with you. If I had the choice between the Builder Demon or Belakor, I personally would have gone with Belakor, even if that means losing out on all the customization and so on. This is purely because well, Belakor is a massive character. He features in many books. He's been in a central plot point for many, many settings. I just don't understand why he is not a legendary lord. I imagine that we'll eventually get him in the future. Let's be honest about that. The community, like yourselves, have been very vocal about that, and Creative Assembly will have to listen to it because Belakor is such a big character. But I just don't understand why he's not a playable character now, if he's already got the assets and everything. This is just another Boris Todbringer situation. I just really hope that we don't have to wait another 5 years to be able to get that. Well, we're still waiting for Boris Todbringer. It's something that I find very personally frustrating because they have some characters, like Boris again, the Red Duke, they've got full, unique models. Why can't they be playable? Belakor is now getting that treatment, and I don't think he's done in a right way, so obviously I'm going to talk about a little bit of a spoiler here, but when you defeat him, you can take control of him. He becomes a playable pseudo-legendary lord for you, and you'll notice that I didn't say for Chaos, because everyone can control him. Yes, that means CATHAY, that means Kislev, that means the Ogre Kingdoms too, and this is absolutely bizarre to me, because it's not a lore versus gameplay thing here, it's a more of a logical way of thinking. Who the hell in their right mind, if you're a Kislevite or a Cathayan or even an Ogre, would think, oh yeah, let's bring him into our faction, he now serves us. This is a character that's very well known in lore. In very, very loads of circumstances, he backstabs literally everyone. But now I can have Belakor leading an army of Kislevites? An army of Cathayans? Again, gameplay over lore, but this makes absolutely no sense from a logical and, yes, lore perspective. But no, this makes no sense whatsoever. This is possibly my biggest gripe with the whole game. It's nonsensical. No one would do this. I think even the other demon factions wouldn't really bring him into the fold, because why would you trust him? This is like trusting Grima Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings. Or trusting Games Workshop not to destroy your setting or ruin your favorite army. It just makes no sense to me, and it just really takes me away from the actual story of the game. And since we're talking about Belakor, this is the perfect segue to go into the story of the game. You see, Warhammer 3, like Warhammer 2, and technically Warhammer 1, has a storyline, its own narrative to drive the campaign forward. This campaign is not sandbox, just like Warhammer 2 had at the very beginning. The eventual sandbox map is the mega map that we're gonna get eventually, but that requires all three games. Anyways, let's talk about it. So the narrative itself isn't too bad. It's based on the fact that Belakor is trying to ascend to become a god. Yep, everything sounds fine, everything is pretty good lore, it's pretty much everything that we expected from Warhammer Fantasy anyway. So every different playable race and faction, this also includes the ogres, is put into the game in an effort to stop Belakor, for their own motives of course too. You see, Skarbrand for example wishes to regain favour from KHORNE, so knowing that he can then defeat Belakor and find the trapped god Ursun might get him some favour with the Blood God, and maybe he no longer will be in exile, despite the fact that he can call upon KHORNE and he still gets that. It's, yeah, kind of weird. The Kislevites obviously want to stop Belakor so they can rescue Ursun. The Cathayan dragons wish to rescue Ursun because he might know where their long-lost sister is, and it's pretty much how it goes with every different faction. There's a whole different narrative to why you're doing this. Now, the issue, well, everyone's doing the exact same thing. At certain intervals, portals will open up across the area. If you've got a very large kingdom, you might have some issues there, as you won't be able to deal with all the portals, as they'll start to spread corruption at the very beginning, then they'll spawn agents in the name of their god, and lastly, armies will start to spawn too. You as the player need to deal with these portals with your army, your legendary lord, or even some agents to be able to close them, and you need to progress through the story by going into these portals. Your legendary lord must travel to the realms of chaos itself, which is pretty much impossible for most cases. It's strange that mortals can go in there, full armies and so on, but then again, gameplay over narrative, that's perfectly fine. Now, through there you have to do a certain number of tasks and then fight with a survival battle that you've seen before. This is how you achieve a certain demon soul. You need 4 demon souls, surprise surprise, 1 from KHORNE, 1 from TZEENTCH, 1 from NURGLE, 1 from SLAANESH, which means that you have to travel to 4 different realms of chaos throughout your campaign. It can be done very early on and you can complete the campaign by around turn 150, I believe, more or less. But other than the minor story elements, well, yeah, it's the same thing over and over again. I like the story, don't get me wrong. I actually think it's very well written. It's much better than, say, for example, Warhammer 1, which had pretty much no story, and it basically runs circles around Warhammer 2. Warhammer 2's story just didn't make sense whatsoever. This at least fits with the lore, with loads of different chaos rifts opening up, having to get demon souls. It's a bit far-fetched, but it's better and much more believable. I think it's very well done, don't get me wrong. I actually think it's really, really good. But being forced into a narrative every time you want to start up a new campaign is kind of annoying. They should have had a little bit of a toggle there. After you beat the game for the first time, you could start a new campaign and just toggle off the campaign narrative, meaning that you won't have the chaos rifts, you won't have to deal with the demon souls and so on, because sometimes you just want to enjoy and play Total War. You're kind of forced to play the narrative here like you were in the Eye of the Vortex, and that's a bit of an annoying thing because, well, you can lose. Yeah, the other factions can go get all the other demon souls, they can trigger the last event, chaos rifts can just begin opening up permanently because of the last soul, and then they can just defeat Belakor and win for themselves, which, yeah, end of game. Which is annoying. It's really annoying. The Total War series has always been based on a sandbox, and don't get me wrong, like I said, the story's great, but I would love to have that sandbox feeling again. Whilst we will get that when the eventual combined map comes out, we don't know exactly when that's happening, and I would like to have a chill campaign without having to worry about some random NPC faction just ending the game for me. Now, this could be fatigue because I've played for more than 300 hours, that's fair, but Total War games are meant to be replayed over and over and over again. I just want to enjoy the factions and not have to deal with the narratives because I've completed the game. I've played with all the factions, but now I want to try out different stuff. Eventually mods will come out too. But what's that going to be like? Is it just going to affect mods? Is it going to force everything to break? You know what I mean? Now, I'm not going to say just a simple toggle or anything because I don't know how much work it needs to just take that off and so on, but it would have been a great quality of life feature. This game was in development for what, 3.5 years they confirmed? It would have been nice if they thought about this as, well, not everyone wants to play a story. Some of them do, and I like playing the story, but I don't want to play the story all the time. Right, let's talk about something more positive. After about 5 years of fighting in the grass or snow or wherever you were, now we finally have settlements. Yeah, we're not marching out just randomly anymore. Now we actually have settlements. This means that all the different races and factions, even some minor races and factions which feature on the map, have their own unique settlements with their own unique architecture and so on. This makes use of a new settlement battle mechanic which is here and also in sieges. So we have walls, we have defenses, we don't have to fight in flat ground anymore. Now we can actually strategically place our units and see what we can do. The fact is now we can also build up some random towers. We can also build up some walls. It very much depends. The stuff that you're used to seeing from the survival battles from the previews and so on are year 2. I have seen some people saying that they feel it's arcadey. However, I'm looking at it this way. We actually have settlements again. We have very large settlements, very small settlements. It depends on the area, depends on the city, it depends on everything. And yes, we can build up some towers and barricades and so on. Also, we can build them mid-battle as we get more supplies. There are various factors here, like how many control points you have. If your enemy have taken them, you will lose your buildings, you will lose your towers. It's a different system. Some people are saying that they don't like it, and I'm saying this. Think about it this way. Do you want to go back to where we were? With no towns, no settlements? This works out very well. I found the system very enjoyable. It's different and it provides a lot of different stuff to you. It depends on what you're fighting in, what maps you're using. Are you the attacker? Are you the defender? What units you have, what units they have, how they're building, how you're building. Because if you're the defender, you've got to think ahead. The AI will obviously be one step ahead and will try to build up. They'll even try to lock in your troops. It very much depends on what you're fighting against, really. The maps themselves are gorgeous and it is a massive improvement, especially for anything minor settlement related. It's just so much better. The AI will try to react to you as best as possible. Keep in mind that this is still a Total War game, so the AI is not going to be very intelligent, but I have seen some pretty decent reactionary action, like for example, dealing with a Kislevite area where I was trying to go straight in and they held me down. They literally sent everything just to hold me there, and they were doing damage from afar with their towers and so on. I thought that was quite smart. Then when I decided to split with another battle, they did split. They planned ahead. They realized that they could not stay in one location. Now, obviously, the idea is that you should be able to fall back if you need to and so on, and I haven't seen the AI do that. That's more of a player-only thing, I am imagining. But this is a massive step in the right direction, especially since now we actually have something visual. Believe it or not, sometimes visual is very important. Yes, you can fight outside if you so wish, it's very possible to do that, you can just charge out and that works, but I want to see towns, I want to see cities. It's very important to me because obviously every other Total War game does this. Why for 2 games we did not? If we look at the siege battles, they are really impressive. Some of the maps are absolutely massive with multi-layers, different structures. It depends on where you're fighting and obviously what you're controlling and so on, but it's just so much better now. You don't have to stay on the walls anymore. You can fall back if you need to. The AI generally won't do this. They will have deployed in certain areas, and unfortunately it's still Total War AI. It's something that you really need to know about. But all in all, as a defender, if you're dealing with, say for example, many stacks, you can have a few people at the walls, fight a little bit, shoot, and then fall back to other defenses where you have barricades up and running, where you have different forces ready and waiting. You shouldn't have to feel forced to go back and defend from just one point, but you will need to be a bit more active, and I feel that this feels a lot better. It's probably as best as we're gonna get until the new engine appears for the Total War engine. It's just how it is. However, you will notice that aggressively, your enemies will also split up. They will force you to split. I feel that that's a major improvement from the Total War AI at the very least, because in most cases, if you had, say for example, GCCM mod, they will all deploy together, and they're easy to take out. Now, if you've got a town or a city which might be 360, or has, for example, multiple entrances, they will work around. They will try and make sure that you have to split up, making you weaker. Are sieges perfect? No, they're not, but they are 100 times better than what we had in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, that's for sure. Now, obviously, I focus around the single player aspect. I prefer that type of gameplay rather than multiplayer, so I'm not reviewing that type of stuff. I'm going for a purely single player playthrough. But I'm going to try and line out my conclusions here because, yeah, this has been a long video, and if I wanted to keep it going, it could stay to like a 4-hour video or something. There's obviously some aspects which I haven't talked about, which is, for example, diplomacy, but diplomacy is still not great. It's better, but it's copy-pasted from a Total War Saga Troy mostly, so I feel that this is not really a new feature. It's new to Warhammer, but if you've played Troy, yeah, it's just better diplomacy. Just the modifiers make diplomacy so much better. Now, in my honest opinion, after, let me just check right now, 338 hours of gameplay since I was given early access, should you buy this game? I feel that Total War Warhammer 3 is a massive step in the right direction. It is miles better than Warhammer 1 and is likely in a better state of launch than Warhammer 2 was. With this game, you're getting a bunch of different playable races and factions. I'm not talking about the Ogre Kingdoms here because they are technically a DLC, and if you're watching this in the future, a few weeks after launch and so on, you'll have to buy them to play them. But as it stands, the game is enjoyable. I'm being very honest here. It's something that I've wanted for a long time. I've been waiting for Demons. I've been waiting for Kislev. I had no idea that CATHAY was coming until, well, they told us. But it's something which is bringing to light the Warhammer fantasy world and then bringing a big conclusion to the series. We're nowhere near that, however. Loads of DLCs to come into the future, and we're not going to talk about that. But I feel that the game will get a lot better in the eyes of the player base and myself when we eventually get the combined map, and we can then decide if we want to play as a race from Game 1, Game 2, or Game 3. The races from Game 3 start out in a much better position than any of the races that we've ever had from Warhammer 1 or Warhammer 2, not counting the DLC Tomb Kings or the Vampire Coast, as they are extremely unique when compared to each other, not only in gameplay, but roster, style, everything. You're not getting like Warhammer 1 had, where every single race is just pretty much the same with a different coat of paint. You're getting different mechanics, you're getting different everything. It's just really good. I have been waiting many years to see the Demons of Chaos. This was something that I've mostly thought that they were going to come as a united front with Chaos Undivided, yet we're getting that and Monogod factions too. This is a Warhammer game that will provide me with many hours of playtime, and if Creative Assembly have plans to update the races from Game 1 and Game 2 to the standard of Game 3, this will be the Warhammer game I've always dreamt of having. But we're talking about the base game itself, and the base game is wonderful. I would have to give it a 8.5 out of 10. It has some issues, yes, and those will eventually get patched out and fixed, or at least I hope. But Creative Assembly do take note of these issues and do try to get them fixed as soon as possible. Had we had the option to turn off the narrative and just have a pure sandbox experience after completing the narrative, or if we didn't want to complete the narrative and so on, I would have given this a 9.5. This is so much better than Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2. I am, in all honesty, having a lot of fun. After I'm done with this review, I'm going to, well, upload it and release it, but after which I'm going to turn on the game again and have some fun. I'm going to finish off my Nikari campaign and then start a campaign with Korgath, because I've learned how to play differently with him. The Warhammer series has come a long way in the years that it's been out. It's getting better and better with every installment. And this is such a massive change. I was joking around with some other creators on a private chat saying if you could roll back to the first patch of Warhammer 1 and then compare the first patch of Warhammer 3, it's like two completely different games. Which, yes, both games are completely different, but it's more in the state of it's the same setting. Yet with all the advancements that the series has had, this is fantastic. This is a great game, and it's only going to get better. Paired with the fact that Creative Assembly have been listening to the fanbase, like for example adding in a prologue which teaches people how to play Total War, I feel like it's going to be great for even new players. Which if players are interested in the narrative, they should also play even if they're long-standing veterans, as there's a story there too. I feel very confident that this game is going to be a massive success and that we will get loads of content because of it, and it's only going to get better. Total War is always going to have some issues at launch. It's how they've always been. However, I feel like it's going to be less here. I can easily find myself playing this over and over again. If they didn't have the narrative, it would be even more so. But I'm having a lot of fun, and I think you guys will too. I'm not going to be that guy and put a pre-order link in the description below or pin comments and so on. If you want to pre-order it, go and pre-order it. If you want to wait a while and wait until the game has a few more DLCs and all that, that's fine too. But I'm telling you that I'm having a lot of fun with this. Do I wish that Creative Assembly would have done a few things differently? Yes, I really do, and that's been made clear in this video. There are some issues, yes, but I don't think anything breaks the game. You guys will enjoy this. I really do think so. If you've been waiting for demons, if you've been waiting for Kislev, if you've been waiting for CATHAY, if you've been waiting for the ogres, there's a lot here. There is an absolute lot to play. But with all that being said, I have been rambling for about an hour, and I am very, very tired. This video is going to come out much later than usual, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and let's have a bit of a discussion. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.